Pamela Courson woke up on the morning of July 3, 1971, and Jim Morrison was dead. This is the fact from which everything that follows must be understood. She was there. She was in the apartment on Rue Beautreillis when it happened, and she was the one who found him, and she was 27 years old, and the world she had inhabited for the previous 6 years. The world organized around knowing Jim Morrison more completely than anyone else alive, had ended in the space between sleeping and waking in a bathtub in Paris, in the specific and irreversible way that things end when there is no returning from what has happened. What followed the 8 months between the morning of July 3, 1971, and the morning of March 25, 1972, when Pamela Courson died in a Los Angeles apartment of a heroin overdose at the age of 27, has never been adequately told. Not because the events are undocumented, there are accounts, interviews given by people who knew her, records of the legal proceedings around Jim Morrison's estate, the evidence of the work she did to protect his literary legacy in the months available to her. But the accounts have always been organized around Jim Morrison rather than around Pamela Courson. They treat the 8 months as an epilogue to his story, rather than as a story in its own right. They miss the specific, human thing that the 8 months actually were, the life of a person who knew Jim Morrison without the image, who had been the keeper of the version of him that existed before and underneath and alongside the mythology, and who spent the last 8 months of her life trying to ensure that version survived into a world that was rapidly deciding it preferred the mythology. Pamela Susan Courson had been with Jim Morrison since 1965. She was there before Light My Fire reached #1, before the image of the Lizard King had been constructed and distributed, before the leather and the magazine covers and the concert films and all the rest of the apparatus that the fame had generated. She had known him on the Venice Beach Pier, in the London Fog Residency, in the Laurel Canyon house, in the hotel rooms of the 1968 tour where he had written letters he carried in his jacket pocket without posting them. She had known him in the ordinary hours that fame consistently obscures, the mornings with coffee, the afternoons with books, the evenings when he was simply a person in a room rather than the public event he had been required to be since the first album. This knowledge was the thing she protected in the 8 months, not the mythology was. Already protecting itself, was already generating the momentum that would eventually produce the Père Lachaise pilgrimage site and the leather jacket replicas and the biographies and the documentaries and all the other forms through which a dead artist's image travels indefinitely through the culture. The mythology needed no protection. What it needed and what it received from the machinery of fame was amplification. What needed protection was the work. The notebooks that Jim had been filling since adolescence, the manuscripts of the poems that had not yet been published, the recordings that existed in various states of completion, the specific, irreplaceable documentary record of what Jim Morrison had actually been making all along, not the image, but the poems, the films, the journals, the writing that was the reason for the image in the first place. This was what Pamela Courson spent the 8 months protecting. She returned to Los Angeles in the weeks after Jim's burial at Père Lachaise. She had stayed in Paris long enough to manage the immediate necessities, the bureaucratic requirements of a death in a foreign country, the press attention that the news had generated, the first wave of the mythology making that began within days of the news becoming public. Then she came home to Los Angeles, to the house in Laurel Canyon, to the city where the career had happened, and where the machinery was already working at full speed to process Jim Morrison's death into the usable form of legend. She worked with the Morrison estate and with the literary agents and with the surviving members of the band to ensure that the collection of Jim's unpublished writing, the notebooks, the manuscripts, the poems that had never been songs, would eventually reach publication in a form that honored what they actually were. This was not easy work. The estate had legal complexities. The family relationships were complicated by Jim's estrangement from his parents and by the fact that Jim and Pamela had never been legally married, which placed Pamela in the ambiguous position of the person who knew him best having no formal legal standing in the decisions about his work. She navigated these complications with the specific determination of someone who understands that the thing at stake is more important than the difficulty of reaching it. Ray Manzarek watched her work during those months with the particular attention of someone who had been Jim Morrison's closest musical collaborator and who understood, perhaps better than anyone except Pamela herself, what the notebooks and the manuscripts represented. He saw her in the Laurel Canyon house, sorting through papers, organizing the materials that would form the basis of the posthumous publications. He saw her meet with publishers and with estate lawyers with the focused attention of someone who had a clear understanding of what she was there to accomplish. He did not romanticize what he saw. He understood it as work, the specific, unglamorous, necessary work of ensuring that the thing Jim Morrison had cared most about, the poems, found its way to the world in the form he had intended rather than in the form the mythology preferred. John Densmore spoke to Pamela several times during the 8 months. The conversations, as he described them later, were not primarily about grief, or not only about grief. They were about Jim. Specifically about the Jim that the previous year's events had been steadily obscuring, not the Lizard King, not the rock and roll casualty, not the 27 Club member, but the person who had gotten up early and made coffee and read for hours and argued about Nietzsche and laughed at things that struck him as genuinely funny, and had conversations at 2 in the morning about whether language could close the distance between one human consciousness and another. The person who had been standing on a pier in Venice in 1965 before any of the rest of it existed. Pamela was the primary keeper of that person, and John's conversations with her were the closest he could get, in the 8 months following Jim's death, to the version of Jim that the mythology was already burying. Robbie Krieger visited the Laurel Canyon house once in the months following the news. He found Pamela in the condition that people find people in during grief, present and not entirely present simultaneously, conducting the ordinary business of living while carrying something that the ordinary business of living was not large enough to contain. They talked for a while. Robbie did not try to say the things that people say when they do not know what to say. He sat with her in the way that musicians sometimes sit with things, without forcing, without performing comfort, simply present in the space with whatever was in it. What nobody in Pamela Courson's life during the 8 months fully understood, what the people around her saw only in glimpses, was the specific burden that came with being the keeper of the unmythologized version of Jim Morrison in a world that was rapidly standardizing the mythologized one. The mythology was clean, portable, commercially legible. It could be put on a t-shirt, referenced in a magazine profile. Evoked in the opening lines of an obituary, it said, "Rock poet, dangerous frontman, 27 leather, Venice Beach, The Doors." It was accurate as far as it went, and it was not what Pamela Courson had known. What she had known was messier and more human and infinitely harder to preserve. The mornings when he was working on a poem that was not going anywhere and knew it and kept working anyway. The afternoons reading in the house, not performing anything, simply reading. The conversations about Rimbaud that went in directions she had not expected and that she had written down afterward because she knew they mattered even when she could not immediately say why. The specific quality of his attention when he was listening to something that genuinely interested him, which was different from the quality of his attention on stage and different from the quality of his attention in interviews, and was, of all the versions of his attention, the one that she had most needed to be on the receiving end of and most missed. She was keeping this version alive in the only way available to her, through the work, through the notebooks reaching publication, through the conversations with John Densmore and the visits from Robbie Krieger and the long afternoons in the Laurel Canyon house with the papers spread out on the table. Through the specific act of insisting, in every conversation about Jim Morrison's legacy, that the poems were the primary thing, not the performances, not the image, not the motorcycle jacket or the Père Lachaise grave, but the poems, the thing he had been pressing toward since before any of the rest of it existed. She died on March 25, 1972. She was 27 years old, the same age Jim had been. The cause was a heroin overdose. She died in an apartment in Los Angeles, far from the Rue Beautreil's apartment where Jim had died, but in some essential way in the same place, in the aftermath of a loss that the 8 months had not resolved and that had not diminished, and that had run through the work and the conversations and the ordinary business of living, without ever becoming the kind of thing that ordinary life could contain. The legal proceedings that followed her death eventually established the disposition of Jim Morrison's estate. The notebooks were eventually published: Wilderness, The American Night, the collected writings that gave the world the version of Jim Morrison that Pamela Courson had spent the last 8 months of her life trying to protect. Whether they were published in the form she would have wanted, with the emphasis she would have wanted, with the priority she would have insisted on, these are questions that cannot be answered, because the person who knew the answers died at 27. What can be said is this: she knew him. She knew the version of him that the mythology does not contain and that the notebooks only partially reveal. She was in the rooms he was in before the cameras arrived and after they left. She received the letters he carried in his jacket pocket without posting. She listened to the late-night conversations and wrote them down. She sat in the Laurel Canyon house with the coffee he made and the books he was reading and the ordinary, unmythologizable facts of a person's daily life. And she spent the 8 months she had left after July 3, 1971, trying to give that person to the world in the only form that would last: the poems, the notebooks, the writing that was. The real work, the thing he had always been doing underneath and before and alongside everything else. She was 27 years old. She had 8 months. She worked. The specific daily texture of Pamela Courson's 8 months in Los Angeles has not been extensively documented. What exists are fragments, the impressions of people who saw her during that time, the records of the estate proceedings, the evidence of the work she did with the notebooks. From these fragments a picture assembles itself, though never completely, because completeness would require the account of the person who was living the months, and that person is not available to give it. She was seen in the Laurel Canyon house in the mornings, working, the papers spread on the table, the notebooks in their stack, the particular organizational intelligence of a person who understands that the thing they are sorting through has value and that the value requires care. People who visited her during this period, friends from before the Jim years and friends from within them, described the Laurel Canyon house as both recognizable and changed. Recognizable because it was the same house, the same objects, the same physical space that had held both of them through the years of the career. Changed because the presence that had organized around Jim Morrison, the pull of gravity that his existence had exercised on everything in its vicinity, was absent, and the absence made the familiar space strange in the specific way that absences do when the person who is absent was the primary fact of a place. She was 27 years old and she had been with Jim Morrison since she was 21, 6 years, the entirety of the career from the London fog residency to the Paris months. She had been present for more of it than anyone else in more of its forms: the early shows, the recording sessions, the touring, the writing, the arguments about the direction of things, the conversations at 2 in the morning that were not arguments but explorations, two people thinking together about things that had no institutional space and needed to find their own. She had been present for all of it, and the all of it had ended on the morning of July 3, in a bathtub in Paris when she was 27 years old. She could have described Jim Morrison in a way that no biographer has ever managed, because she had access to the private self that the biographers have only the public record to approach. She could have described the specific quality of his attention when he was writing, not performing writing, not being a writer for an audience, but actually in the process of finding what the poem was, which was a different thing and required a different quality of presence. She could have described what he was like when a poem was not going anywhere and he knew it, the specific, unglamorous frustration of a person who is pressing against something that will not yield, who knows the thing they are reaching for and cannot find the way to it. She could have described what it was like to be the person he talked to when the talking that needed to happen was not the talking that performed insight, but the talking that was simply figuring something out. None of this was recorded, or none of it has been made public, which is not quite the same thing. There are the conversations she had in the 8 months, the accounts she gave to John Densmore and to the friends who came through the Laurel Canyon house, the evidence of her understanding of Jim Morrison that shows through the decisions she made about the notebooks. But the full account does not exist in accessible form. What exists is partial, and the partiality is one of the genuine losses in the record of who Jim Morrison was. Bill Siddons, who managed the Doors' affairs through the estate's initial period, found Pamela Courson's knowledge invaluable in ways that were not primarily emotional. Her understanding of the notebooks, which ones had been completed in what sense, which fragments were independent poems and which were drafts toward something longer, which material Jim had felt was ready and which he had been holding back, was specific and detailed, and came from years of being the person who was in the room when he was working. She was not guessing. She was reporting from direct observation, and the legal standing she lacked as an unmarried partner in a state that did not recognize common law marriage meant that her knowledge was constantly being applied to situations in which she had no formal authority, which produced a persistent friction between what she knew and what she was permitted to do with the knowing. The notebooks that were eventually published in the years following both deaths, as the estate worked through the legal and editorial decisions, carry the mark of her work in them, though her name does not appear in the way that an editor's name appears. The organization of the material, the decisions about what constituted a completed poem and what constituted a fragment, the insistence that certain pieces be treated as primary rather than supplementary, these reflect an understanding of Jim Morrison's intentions that could only have come from the person who had been watching him work for 6 years. Pamela Courson's 8 months are in those books, invisible and essential. She did not live to see the publications. She died in March 1972, 8 months after Jim, at the same age. The timing has always seemed, to the people who knew both of them, like something that cannot be entirely accounted for by the facts of the case, not mysticism, not fate, but the specific logic of two lives that had been so thoroughly organized around each other that the removal of one created conditions that the other could not sustain indefinitely. She was 27. He had been 27. The number has become a cultural artifact, the 27 Club, the mythology of the age and its associations with the particular kind of person who burns at a frequency that the standard life expectancy was not designed to accommodate.